Thank you, and welcome to Genius Tea Time with Molly Freedenberg. I'm so glad you could do this with us. This is terrific.
I'm
So
so
I'm going,
pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
yeah. And introducing Molly in her own words. Molly is a disabled writer, artist, and activist who has spent her life moving within and between various subcultures and is passionate about the community and utility of underground movements, but also the importance of being intentional and vigilant about the opportunities for abuse of power and exploitation of marginalized peoples within them. Before she became housebound with MECFS, she was a dancer, arts nonprofit administrator, event producer, multi-commune founder and/or member, Burning Man devotee and then defector, and journalist, most recently as culture editor of the now-defunct indie weekly, the San Francisco Bay Guardian. She writes the Substack Well Actually, which is lovely. You should check it out. And is working on a memoir about her experience living at the art monastery in Italy. And today we're going to be supporting ME Action. Would you like to tell us about this group?
Sure. So Emmy Action is an advocacy group that was founded by Jen Brea, who made the film Unrest about MECFS. And this they advocate at a policy level. They lobby for disability rights in general and for research and funding for MECFS and long COVID specifically. They also have an amazing set of resources, both about the illness, about the treatments, about how to find providers, and they keep what they call the MEpedia, which is sort of a Wikipedia of all treatments and terms and research related to this disease. So it's just an incredible resource. About 10 years ago, there was sort of nothing on this illness, and they have really become the center of both education and advocacy and activism. So they mean a lot to me.
Which is terrific. I mean, yeah, certainly there have been plenty of people with ME beforehand, but there is quite a lot more since COVID, and long COVID is affecting a lot of people. Um, I never remember how to pronounce it. Myalgic encephalitis?
Myalgic encephalomyelitis
Encephalomyelitis.
slash chronic fatigue
Yeah,
syndrome is the way
yes,
most people know it.
yes, yes. So, nerve bundle inflammation.
Exactly.
Okay. No, and I'm so glad you could talk to us about communes because so many people are talking about this. They're talking about building tiny home communities. They're talking about finding ways to live differently. And you had a lot of experience with both communal and semi-communal living. I've had some. We're talking about that. By the way, and if you're going to do them, maybe don't do them in Fairbanks, Alaska, um, which is where I spent a lot of my formative years. And 60 below is a rough patch to hoe, no matter what. So maybe someplace where the weather isn't trying to kill you. But you have lots of stories, and I'd love to hear more about what you were doing, what you found was drawing you to communes and communal living in the first place, and then what did and didn't work for you.
Sure. Um, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about what it is that drew me. I started, my first commune was when I was in college. So I'm like 19, it's 1998. And I think there was a combination for me of idealism, humanitarianism, this image of being able to live differently and outside of mainstream society, somewhere more feminist, somewhere more kind, somewhere more cooperative, um, somewhere more friendly to weirdos like me. I did not feel like the world was a friendly, natural place for me, um, and for other people, and so I definitely wanted to live in a utopia. And then I think on a personal level, and this was definitely not conscious, was I was also looking for a sense of belonging, of home. I I have some writing somewhere where I had this fantasy that I would show up somewhere and they would go, "Our daughter, we've been waiting for you. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. You're home now forever. We see you. We're going to tell you who you are. We're going to tell you what you're supposed to do with your life. We're going to fix everything that's wrong with you. And this is the place where you will be fixed, where you will be fixed and where everything will be fixed. Everything that's wrong with society, everything that's wrong with you in your life. There's sort of a double utopian fantasy. And so
Not asking
I,
a lot.
no, I mean, very small, very reasonable expectations. So it's shocking that I kept being disappointed. I don't know how. But
Yeah.
I did over the course of the next 20 years, keep seeking, joining, ending up running, and then leaving a series of both what we would think of as sort of traditional communes or intentional communities, places where people intentionally come together to live together communally around a set of ideals, and then sort of commune adjacent organizations, what I think of as things like a Burning Man camp that has a year round situation, arts organizations, nonprofits, sort of punk art groups on the side that all share very similar traits and that I also joined for similar reasons.
Yeah. Yeah, we were talking about that I found that with summer stock theater, that there are certain things, there are a lot of different arts organizations that can become like that very easily. But what were the things that were both like really, really appealing about it and then maybe said, ooh, this is not what was working so well?
I mean, I would say, like, if we're talking about like what I really liked about communal living, like sort of what the pros are versus what the cons are, um, I mean, it really is or can be as fun as you think it will be. Um, and there are things that you can do when you're living communally that just don't happen even in a roommate situation, like, I mean, when people think about, like, when I lived at the art monastery in Italy, we really would have, dinner under the stars with like a hurdy-gurdy expert from Florence, and then an opera singer from Germany, and then a ritual theater expert from the Canary Islands. And you're eating amazing Italian food and you're drinking wine and you're talking about art and philosophy, and someone is playing music over there, and then someone else joins them, and then someone else is doing interpretive dance to that music. And yeah, and then you stay up late into the night talking about ideas. I mean, those things really do happen. There's also, I mean, sharing resources, being able to live in places that you could never afford on your own. I've lived in like some amazing mansions, or just being able to like have a nicer stove than you would have on your own, or from a sustainability standpoint, like it's sort of cool to be able to like really have a composting system or have your own chickens, or like not everybody needs their own car. It's sort of cool to like have one car for everybody. There's something that feels good about that. Um, I'm trying to see if there's any. I probably don't need to check my notes. So, well, and then there's the part where like you are never alone. I mean, you do have like constant family and companionship and support, um, and company, and that is really, really cool. I mean, it's also what can get kind of dangerous, but, yeah, it really, I mean, it's like living in the college dorms all the time, especially in the beginning, You're just whatever you need, there's somebody there to do the project with you, or to you could cry on their shoulder, whatever it is. The downside,
Once the honeymoon period is over?
once the honeymoon period is over, um, I mean, first of all, it is so much work, um, because it is a relationship with multiple people, and it's also an organization, and a lot of them are also businesses. And so if you imagine what it's like to do a group project or to live with roommates or to be married, and then you scale that up to 5, 10, 20 people who you wouldn't necessarily marry. These are people who are probably more different than you would necessarily choose to be in that close relationship with. There's a lot of personalities, a lot of conflicts. It also, I found that there really is a thing about, like, it's amazing to have people around all the time and to share everything, but also personal space, personal belongings, differences in opinion and values about personal space or belongings, or how late you stay up or how loud you play the music. Sometimes you really do want your own car when you want a car. Um, and then there are more insidious pieces of it that can happen. Um, there can be like peer pressure, um, there can be actual abuse. Lots of like sexual harassment type stuff can happen in these kinds of places. Lots of exploiting people's labor. It's not always the best place to be old or disabled or a person of color or um or different from the group in any sort of way. Um, Also, for a lot of these places, like once you want to have kids, or if you want to have any sort of kind of make your own personal decisions, it can be really tough. And it's a really hard place. Class actually comes up a lot, and like income disparity. Um, so they can be really tricky and they can be really traumatic, um, because these places tend to have an element. They're not unlike religious organizations. And so when there's conflict, it's happening to you. It's not just like you're in a fight with your coworker or your boss. They're also your roommate. They're also your best friend. They're also your landlord. And they're like identified with your identity. So it's
Yeah,
really tricky.
yeah, because we were talking at the beginning, it's like sometimes it can be a cult, sometimes it's a homeowners association. And um, there are some real problems inherent in both of those things. And depending on what the structure is and what kind of personality types and conflicts you have, and how domineering some can be and demanding of authority.
Yeah. And also how, I mean, who is involved and who's sort of leading has a lot to do with it. Who you are and how you respond to that has a lot to do with it. And I definitely find that there are certain personality types that do best in these situations. And also, generally, I find the people who put the least in tend to get the most out of it. And so that, like, if
Mm,
you're a visiting artist at the art monastery and you're there for 6 weeks and you make some work and then you go home to your regular job that pays you well and your family and your own car, you think the art monastery is the most incredible place you've ever been. Meanwhile, the people who are running it are working 80-hour weeks. They're burnout, they're miserable, they're fighting with each other. They can't go home to their families for the holidays. They don't have any belongings because they don't have any income, and those are the people that are, so like I've been in therapy for 5 years because of one of my communes, whereas my friend who visited is like, I want to go back. The best thing I ever did in my life.
yeah. Yeah, that can be so different based on what your experience is. What have you found has worked out best when you're dealing with it income wise? Because I think it's something not a lot of people want to talk about necessarily, but there's that. I mean, you're not getting all of your materials necessarily by making them.
Yeah, money is really tricky when it comes to these situations. And I think a lot of people think that communal living is somehow like a solution to money problems. Or that it will somehow solve a money issue. And there's a lot of like not talking about money. And the reality is that, first of all, setting up a commune is very expensive. Um, and you're getting into a financial arrangement with people if you're going to be setting it up. And if you are not, like if one person is donating land or one person is buying it and the rest of you are just on the team, then you get into situations where, unless you are extremely transparent, and that this is kind of my recommendation across the board, is that you have to name all of these dynamics and be transparent about what they are. Because unless you're transparent, what will happen is that you'll say that everyone is the same and you're doing democracy or you're doing consensus building. But in actuality, the person who bought the land makes the final decision. And that creates an invisible power dynamic. And invisible power dynamics create lots of weird conflict, lots of weird resentment, can lead to things like abuse of power. Um, so I find that, first of all, what works is just being transparent about what it is that you're doing, whatever it is. But in general, I've found that the places that seem to be the most sustainable are the ones that do income sharing. There are two ways to do it. You either are all in on income or you're all out on income. So places like Alpha Farm in Oregon, which was my first commune and is the one that it started in the 70s, it's still around. Once you're in, and there's like a probation period before you can do this, which is also really important. But once you're in, everyone puts in all of their money, and then everyone is supported the same amount by the group pool. Um, which makes a huge difference, partly because when you don't do this, you end up with somewhere like, again, I'm going to use the art monastery as an example, where we were all supported by the art monastery. We didn't have to put in any money, but nobody, all our food and rent and everything was taken care of as long as we were living and working there. But some people had ways of making money outside of the organization. Some had family money, some had savings. And so some people were able to travel. Some people were able to go home for the holidays. Some people were able to buy more stuff than other people. And what that meant is that they got breaks from the intensity of living together or living in intensely close conditions with no heat. They got to go, back to New York City and have heating and recharge. And the people who didn't have the money didn't. And that creates both resentment, but also just some of the people are burnout and miserable, and some of the people are recharged and fine. So the income sharing situations work because at least you're on the same level. The other situation that works is if everyone has a job outside and you just contribute kind of to a communal pool.
Got it.
But that only works if you're all sort of in the same income bracket. Like that's only if you want to live in a community where everybody works in tech, where everybody makes, 75K a year, um, which is not the kind of community I want to live in. I want there to be room for people who are at different levels. Um, and so if you're going to do that, then you have to be really transparent about how you're going to make room for that. Because what I've seen in that situation is that they say that they're open. I lived in a place in San Francisco that had kind of different tiers where you could have your own room and pay this much. You could live in bunk beds in a communal room and pay this much. You could work for the organization and get your rent for free. And that sounds like it's sort of equitable, but what that actually means, like as a disabled person, I actually need private space more than the average person, but I also couldn't afford to have a job that would let me pay for that room. And I was working for the organization, not because I wanted to, but because I had to pay for my rent, which means I'm never leaving the house. I'm my peer's employee. And so I become sort of an indentured servant,
Yeah.
um, which is a kind of like sort of passive, almost accidental exploitation. Um, I mean, maybe it's too generous to say it's passive and accidental, but definitely, I mean, no one intended it to be that way. The idea was let's have poor people be able to live here, and here's how, without realizing that this is actually locking those people into a situation that is bad for them.
Yeah, it's a little
Um,
poison pill in that.
so my recommendation would be um, to really consider those dynamics and really be transparent about what it is that you want. And if you really want to be able to have poor people or people at different income levels live in your space, if you want it to be tech people and artists generally don't make as much as tech people, then you have to have room for adjusting not just how much people pay. It's I think it's important that everyone contribute equally according to their needs and their resources.
Yeah.
And that's the other tricky piece.
Kind of a constant
Also,
negotiation. Yeah.
yes.
I mean, in its own way, this is just as complex as any serious polyamory relationship, which only works if you're being super transparent. And there's so many ways for it to work badly.
I think polyamory is an amazing analogy for it. I mean, it really is a polyamorous relationship on many levels. And just like polyamory in the wild, more often than not, I see it done poorly. And more often than not, I see people call it polyamory when that's not actually what they're doing. But actual polyamory, if you're doing it ethically, is really beautiful. And similarly with communal living. And both of them, it's about being really clear about your own intentions and your own stuff, being really communicating well with everyone and being really transparent about what it is that you want and what it is that you're doing.
What were some of like the best examples that you saw of when things work out really well? Because of course there are so many opportunities for it to go poorly, like
I
literally
know.
any
I
other
have so
human
many of those
relationship.
stories.
And there's always more of those. There's always more. It's like, let us tell you the woes.
um, I mean, I would say even though the embassy and the Red Victorian, which are both kind of urban San Francisco co-living communities that didn't work well for me, um, they both are actually turned out to be pretty successful and sustainable in their own way. Especially the embassy, the people involved are very principled, very committed to the concepts, and are really doing it for the reasons they say they are. And so they've actually started several other communes. There's one they started for people who just got out of prison, um, as a kind of, I don't even want to say halfway house because it's not that. It's a communal living situation for people who have that shared experience with the support of other people to bring them into a culture that normally they would be excluded from. Um,
Wow.
yeah, it's really, really cool. And it's a really cool way to leverage community and communal living to do like actual good in the world and something beyond your own experience. Because this place was started by a bunch of, white 30 somethings who work in tech. Um, they also have a lot of really cool like community offerings and community talks where they talk about things specifically like anti-racism, like accountability. So that is something that I've seen that's really cool. Um, I think Alpha Farm actually is kind of an example of like a place that's, I mean, they've stuck around since 1972, which is really hard to do with some of the original members. Um, and I had my own complaints about that place. Again, it didn't quite work for me, but it continues to be inspiring to people and be a home to people. And again, I think it's because it's very principled and very, um, and again, like it has the income sharing, it has its structures in place. I think for me, the primary advice that I would give to anyone, and the main thing that applies to places that work, if you before you start a commune or before you join a commune, is to get super clear and super honest with yourself about what it is that you actually want. What exactly is your fantasy? Um, what is it that you're looking for? What is the dream? Because there's an assumption that everyone has the same dream. And when you start a commune or you join a commune, they all look the same in the beginning. The steps to get, like, there are 500 different goals, but the steps to get to them are the same for the first 20 steps. So it's really easy for everyone to project their fantasy onto those steps and think that you're all doing the same thing. And then 2, 5 years in, once you're big enough, you've gotten to the stage where those things start to matter, you all of a sudden realize, wait a minute, I want an organic self-sustaining farm, and I want to run my own theater troupe, you know?
Yeah.
And now you're 5 years in and you've moved and you've lost all your money, and, you know, so, or when you're joining, when you're someone like me, like I wish that I had gotten really honest about, I am looking to like fix my mental and physical health so
Yeah.
that I could have, I mean, hopefully I would have gone, wait a minute, I'm not going to find that in one of these places. But even if I hadn't come to that conclusion, I could have at least gone to each place and gone, okay, is this a place that is this Burning Man camp going to fix my physical and mental health? Does it look like these are the people? No, probably not. Um, and I think that alone, asking yourself that, and then asking that of the people that you might have join you, or that you might, or that are running it, to get a sense of what their secret goal is.
Yeah.
Because again, that's one of the things. Um, the art monastery was run by someone who really just wanted his own theater troupe,
Okay.
but instead he wanted a place for all artists to do their own art. And who doesn't want to join that?
That sounds
So,
terrific.
so people would join, and then you get there and you realize that the only time you're given to do art is for the collective art, which happens to be directed by him.
Mm. Mm.
The
Yeah.
next commune, he was a little more honest. And yeah, and yes, I made the mistake of joining 2 communes with the same guy.
No. With the same cult leader. Ah.
But in the second one, he was a little more honest about what the goal was. And
Okay.
that was more, that did feel better. It was clearer and it was easier for people, less people joined, but the people who joined were clear on what they were joining and were less upset when it didn't turn out to be what they thought. So,
I think, and it's also, I think, so important to keep looking at your own self because your needs are going to change. Your physical needs, your life is going to change. Who you are and your awareness of yourself is going to change. And so that's what I've seen a lot of times in more semi-communal things where things have shifted, even like Society for Creative Anachronism groups or Ren Fair groups, because there's certain similarities. It's like, okay, this can work for a while, And then maybe too many people have had affairs with too many other members of the group, and we've done it. It's just all out at that point. Um, I know.
Yeah. Well, and I also think that's an important thing to consider when starting an organization is if this is something that you want to be long term,
Yeah,
or if it's something that you're okay with being temporary or having a lot of turnover.
yeah,
Um, because most of what I've seen is people wanting to do what they want to do with the people they want to do it with. And that tends to be with people like them. And generally that has been a lot of single people or or people who are coupled up, but people who are at that stage of life and they're not considering making room for what happens when people want to have kids, what happens when if someone gets disabled, what happens if someone needs to take care of an elderly parent, what happens when you want a broader life than just these individuals. And again, I think that's why some of these places like Alpha work better, um, because it's multi-generational, because it's flexible, because it's meant to be a lifelong commitment and it was designed that way, as opposed to nobody can live on a bunk bed for the rest of their life.
yeah, yeah. And certainly with disability, unless you're dying early, it's going to happen to you.
Yeah.
Maybe nobody wants to talk about that, but there will be a point of time where you can't keep up with the same chore level, for example, that you can't do some of the same physically the same things that you might have used to do, even if it's a
Yeah,
temporary thing.
exactly.
So assuming no one is ever going to say break their arm, not a very healthy attitude.
Well, and that's where when I was talking about how you have to adjust what it means to contribute the same is important. It's because most of the places I've lived, there's an assumption that everyone will put in the same amount of hours, will do the same specific tasks. There was one specific commune after I had left, a friend went on an artist retreat, and part of the retreat was everyone agreed to garden. And she said, "Look, I have this disability, I can't do manual labor." And she was basically pressured into doing it anyway. And she got really injured, and she couldn't
Yeah.
enjoy the rest of the retreat and and she paid for the privilege. And there just wasn't an awareness, a space for not everyone can do the same amount, can contribute the same amount in the same way. And I felt when I was in the same place that I couldn't take the rests that I need. I couldn't opt out of certain community activities. Um, so yeah, those are all really important considerations. If you want to have a diverse community, if you don't want to kick people out as soon as they get injured, and if you want it to last for a long time.
Yeah. And not telling you to only dwell on the hardships, but like what are some things that you'd say were much more egregious of problems? Like it seems like the inequity can be a really serious, and the opportunity for abuse can be such a serious problem. I've seen that.
Yeah. Um, I think that's the most serious problem and the most important kind of consideration up front. Um, what I've seen, so on kind of the one end of the spectrum is just a lot of exploiting labor, a lot of taking advantage of people who are a lot of people who are drawn to these places are in transition, they're in limbo, they're looking for something, they're spiritual seekers, they're young, they just got out of college, they just dropped out of college, and they're really impressionable, and it's really easy um, to use them for free labor and to not feed them enough, to not heat them enough, to have them sleeping in uncomfortable conditions, to have, I slept in a moldy room for a year and a half.
Ugh.
Um, So there's that end of the spectrum. And then on the other end of the spectrum is, I mean, I've seen people get pressured into doing drugs they didn't want to do. Um, Lots of sexual harassment or consent violations that are, I mean, it's embarrassing to admit that have even been part of this situation of like downplaying what happened and excusing the leader because the girl is a visitor and she doesn't seem like a reliable narrator. It's a really easy to so identify with the community
Yeah,
that you don't, you lose your perspective.
yeah, that makes
Um,
sense.
and I mean, and all the way, and more serious kinds of, consent violations and, um, I mean, people getting really hurt. And I mean, we had one situation where there was a girl who had come who said, the leader will not leave me alone. And I really like being here and I even really like him, but I'm really uncomfortable. And we had multiple meetings about it. And um, the conclusion was that she was the problem.
Oh, Lord.
I
That's
know.
rotten.
On the other side, I've been in a community where there were some complaints against someone who lived there, and there were many meetings about it, and they eventually concluded that he needed to be censured, and he actually was asked to leave. Um, what I realized in that moment was that and then they devised a policy, and what I realized is that these policies need to be devised before you start the community.
Before there's a problem.
Way before there's a problem. Like, one of the things you need to get clear on is what are your values? What will you stand for? What won't you stand for? And what are you going to do if there are violations? How are you going to protect people so that everyone knows what the deal is and everyone knows what to do if something happens? Because often what happens in these situations, these counterculture organizations that don't have an HR department and that are living outside the bounds of society already, and we don't believe in rules, we make our own rules, is that it's really hard to know when you've crossed the line, when you've broken a rule. And so then you spend so much time negotiating what the rules are when really some of this stuff is pretty simple if you think about it outside the context of the complicated interpersonal whatever. Um, And so I think it's really important to do that first when you're setting up your community. And if you're thinking of joining one, ask them, what's your policy on sexual harassment and abuse? What's your policy about disabled people? What's your policy about, you know, labor and volunteers? And if they don't have an answer, then maybe it's not the place for you.
That's just a great general answer. Thank you so much. I do hope you write a book about this, not because I'm going to pressure you to, but just because it would be neat. Um, do any of you have some questions that you would like to ask? Otherwise, I'll just keep asking them, but you are welcome to. You don't have to do it out loud. You can do it in the chat if you prefer. I know. One of the things that I found, oh, I'm sorry, Sally, what's the difference between a commune and communal living?
Um, I mean, there's sort of it depends. I mean, an actual commune, as most people would talk about it, as most people define it, as like if you go to the intentional communities website, which I'll put a link in the chat if anybody's interested in that. Um, it's more of it's an actual intentional organizational structure, people who come together with like a high level of intention, usually a mission statement, a vision statement, some sort of commitment to each other. Usually these places will have a name, usually they'll have a way that they make money. Um, Communal living, like you can refer to living with roommates as a communal living situation. And there can be kind of crossover, there are like roommate situations that are kind of like communes, and there are communes that are really more like a roommate situation. But generally, what I'm talking about is something, sometimes it's called co-living or co-housing or eco-villages or communes, but that are more, they're almost sort of legal entities in a way.
Jinzu is asking, what's it like knowing unsavory truths about people that others adore, and how do you deal with that in a way that feels wholesome to you?
That is a really good and really deep question. Um, that is really that's really painful. What it's like is it's really painful and it's really confusing. And it's been a great source of pain and actually trauma for me, through these groups that not just the communes, but other groups that I've joined. Partly because the truth is that I also adore those people, or I did. Um, but I also know that they have either hurt me or hurt other people or have the capacity to hurt people. And it's deeply painful, both to see other people still support them. It's lonely. Um, it's also painful to think that they will be able to keep doing harm. But there's a third piece of like feeling left out, that like the choice I have to make is either betray myself and stay in relationship to this person and pretend that I don't know what I know so that I can still be part of the group, or I am the one that's punished because this person is the way they are. And the way that I'm punished is that everyone else gets to have the fun together without me, and I have to be alone. Um,
Ouch.
and the way I deal with it that feels wholesome, I mean, lots of therapy, um, friends who get it. Um, and I'm still working on it, I guess, and writing about it. Writing about it is one of the ways that I am coping, because I'm still in that, and is that I'm coping with that alienation. Friends like my Jinsu.
Well, it's profoundly hurtful, and it's requires a real internal strength for you, of course.
It does. And this is part of why I'm passionate about this topic, is because what you're really doing is getting into a relationship with a place and with a bunch of people. And when it goes wrong, or when it hurts you, or it is abusive to you, it is very much like being in an abusive, romantic relationship, except that, so now it's sort of like my friends are still friends with my abusive ex, except my abusive ex is a whole organization involving a whole bunch of other friends and activities. And, it's everything is so much more heightened. Um, there are a lot of parallels to like being excommunicated from religions, or being, leaving cults. So a lot of why I'm passionate about this is just I want people to be careful before they before they join the cult, before they get into the relationship, um, because it can be really painful if it isn't the one for you, or it doesn't go well.
Before it breaks your heart, or something else.
Yeah. And affects the rest of, I mean, I've spent 10 years recovering from one of these communes, I'm still not over it, so I mean, it was some of the best times of my life without question. But it also, I mean, my father died when I was 17, and the trauma of leaving this place was a bigger, harder, more complex trauma.
Angie is asking, have you seen accountability, restorative justice, and repair stuff work in any of these cases?
That's a great question. Um, I, um, in the organizations that I've been a part of, I haven't seen that be nearly important enough. I haven't seen that come up enough. Um, the first thing that has to happen for that to work is for people to actually have that as a value and want to do it. Um, I did see the one that I talked about where there was the guy that they actually asked to leave. That was the closest I've seen to an accountability type situation. They didn't quite get into restorative justice, but that organization actually has since started a series on restorative justice. They're the same people that started the house for the people who had just got out of prison. So I think that they would probably handle it differently now. I think it's possible, and in the aspirational, the part of me that believes that these things can be good and that there is a reason for them, I think that actually a communal situation can be a great sort of experimental lab for something like that. If the people there all agree that what they want to do is live according to transparency and communication and accountability and restorative justice, I mean, the best place to do that is in relationship. So yeah, I think it can work. Just it has to be made explicit and everybody has to buy in. And if they aren't bought in and that isn't made explicit, then the likelihood is it's gonna go the other way.
Yeah, you
Because
may want to run.
humans are human, so it's communal living is sort of like it can be both better than regular living, but also worse than the default way of living. It's sort of depending on which, if you're intentional about it, it can be better. And if you're not intentional, it can spiral out very easily and probably will.
Yeah, we sadly had some people who ended up dead, and they found them in the when the snow thawed. It,
Wow.
so I mean, it can be that direct and that awful, and it can be really just as casual as, wow, this just isn't working anymore. So it depends a lot on the situation and on the group, but transparency is so important. And maybe knowing yourself a little, which is also hard for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I have seen, I didn't mention it earlier. I don't know why I didn't want to go there. Part of it is that it wasn't directly related to the commune, but we did have a situation where someone died, and it felt very much related to. There was a girl who had struggled with drug addiction and mental illness for a long time, and this particular community was very big on drugs. And for those who wonder if all communes are sex cults, no, they aren't all sex cults, but some of them are, and this one was. And it was very big on drugs and group sex, and the leader's girlfriend was in a really fragile place and kept getting pressured to be part of this world, and she would have meltdowns regularly in the middle of these communal parties. And eventually she died. She was high, she was somewhere else, there was some sort of accident, but when she died, multiple people related to the community called me and asked if, sorry, a trigger warning for all of this, but, asked if the leader had killed her, and he hadn't, but the fact that people asked that was so indicative of the energy of what was happening and the level at which no one was kind of taking care of her or each other.
Wow.
And actually was the catalyst for me leaving that place. That was certainly woke me up out of my complacency. But yeah, so I mean, it can get bad if you're not trying to make sure it's good.
Megan is asking, aside from transparency around intention and resource sharing, if you were going to start your own communal living situation today, are there any other elements that you'd include to set things up for success?
Good question. What other elements would I include? Um, I'm just checking my notes really quick. I think, I mean, there are a lot of elements I would include depending on specific communities. Like if I were setting up a place, and this is probably the only situation in which I would do this now is like to set up a community for other disabled people. Um, and there are a lot of things that I would do specifically for that. Um, but for sort of general advice, I think the other thing that comes to me is um, don't try to reinvent all of the wheels. There is this instinct that people have when they're going to do something outside of the mainstream and they're dreaming big, that they want to start everything from scratch. And that's really exciting, but it's not very efficient and it's not very effective. Um, and like we had one of the communes, we decided we were going to like reinvent meetings, but we were not a commune that was built to fix meetings, you know? And so we spent all of this energy like reinventing how to have meetings and what order you do things and who gets to talk. And it was like there are a bazillion companies who have figured out, like, there's a reason that meetings go the way they go. Like, there people have figured that out. We can innovate the thing that we're here to innovate. We're like, we had one where the way we made our money was that people came and stayed. We lived in an old hotel and we had people come stay in the hotel. And so we decided that we were gonna like start from scratch and like research mattresses and research sheets and do our own laundry, and we spent like 6 months researching this stuff. And I was like, you guys, you don't think like the Hilton already did all this research? Like, there's a reason that everybody, like, they use the mattresses, they use the sheets, they use you know, so like, my advice would be, first of all, do the research. It's not as fun. Like, I know everybody just wants to jump in and like make something, but if you're that excited to do it right now, don't start a commune. like, it's like starting a business, Like, it's slow, it's hard, it's boring, it's like it's so much work. And if you can't wait, then you must wait, you know? Um, like, go to other communes, if you're gonna open a farm, go to other farms, figure out how people do farming, go to other, if it's gonna be sort of like a nursing home, go to nursing home, like, and then learn from what those people have already figured out, because I promise you they have figured out more than you were gonna like. You got your degree in accounting, you're not gonna learn more about sheets than the people at the hotel, I promise you.
I mean, that's just such good advice in general. I've been seeing that a lot with people who are trying to start mutual aid organizations or trying to start activism things. Like, if it's already there and something is working, terrific. Use that. That's amazing. If it doesn't exist and you have to, go forth and conquer.
Yes. Yes. And the other piece of it is hire for skills, not for willingness.
Nice.
There is a
Nice.
thing that intentional communities and nonprofits like to do where it's like, okay, we need someone to do the finances. Who is willing to do finances? And then that becomes your CFO.
Yeah. What could possibly go wrong?
What could go wrong? Um, get people who know what they're talking about, at least to advise you. You know, again, I mean, partly because a lot could go wrong and it's very annoying, but partly just because it's efficient. You know, like, again, I know it's more fun to do it yourself. And there is something really cool about living in a commune and getting to become the expert in the thing that you didn't study. And, you know, like I learned how to take a transmission out of a car at Alpha Farm. That was so freaking cool. But if you actually want to get this thing off the ground and have it work well, have people at least advising you who are experts in the thing that the jobs that they're doing.
Sally is asking if you want to, you're going to create a commune. What kind would you create?
I think at this stage, the closest thing I would do is something more like um, more like a co-living or like an eco village kind of arrangement, where it's more about people having their own personal space, their own personal income. Um, there is some sort of community, like shared resources, a communal space. Um, and kind of a shared value system, but it would be more of a mutual aid village type atmosphere, um, where people can live their individual lives, their individual fully expressed lives with like community support. More than what I was looking for before, which was like 24/7 best friend. You know? And I'm not interested in running any fucking businesses.
It's good to know what you don't want. It's really
Yeah.
good to know what you don't want.
Well, and that's also a really important piece if you're gonna start something that needs to earn its own money. Make sure that the thing that you choose is something you actually want to do. Like, we all have this idea that if you join a commune, whatever you do there is gonna feel better than it would normally. But the truth is that if you don't already like gardening, you don't want to spend your entire life at a place that has to farm and go to sell vegetables at the farmer's market for its income. If you don't already like hosting, if you're not one of those people who's like, come over anytime, I can't wait to make the bed for you, don't have a place where the way you make your money is that people come stay at your commune, or that they're constantly coming over and like hosting events. Like if you're an introvert, like don't, you know, like you really have to consider, like, if this weren't a commune and it weren't utopia, is this the kind of lifestyle that would make me happy? Is this what I'm doing already? So yeah, the kind of commune that I would do now is the one that let me live the way I already live, but with more support and more community and like my sister and my friends next door.
That sounds brilliant. And what a great way to do it. Does anyone else have any other questions? And how else can people find you? Oh, Scott, go forth.
Hey, I you made some passing references to Burning Man, and I think some of the things you said are clearly applicable. You know, they're obviously, some of the things you're saying about these experiences you had can be mapped directly onto the Burning Man experience. But obviously, one of the things about Burning Man is you do have that ability to pull away. You're not in, a cult that you're locked into 24/7 because you're only there for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 2 months or whatever. I'm curious, um, in your introduction, there you seem to be saying that you're no longer part of that community, and the word that was actually used was actually
Defector.
dramatic. Defector. Terrific. I am as well, and I'm curious about your, how to take these sorts of things that you're saying generalistically about the commune experience, and what of that you feel was applicable to your experience for Burning Man, what your dissociation from Burning Man, if it was related to those same sorts of reasons why you pulled out of the communes, that sort of narrative.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question and good catch. And yes, it's very related, very applicable. And in fact, I sort of consider Burning Man as like my second commune slash cult. Um, I actually was in had a Burning Man camp that we functioned all year round. So it wasn't just, and a lot of people that get involved in Burning Man do this, whether you have a camp or not. You spend every weekend going to Burning Man parties, you go to the regionals, it sort of becomes part of your life and your identity, and that you always have the calendar in mind. Um, and I loved Burning Man. I loved that camp. I am still very close friends with a lot of people that were in it. And when I say defector, I still have a lot of affection for Burning Man. It's more, part of it is just, um, I'm very disabled now, and Burning Man is not a friendly place for disabled people. In fact, it never has been, and it tried to kill me multiple times. And there is this, in fact, the whole ethos of it is sort of, if you can't handle it, you don't belong here, which itself is ableist. Um, and also there's just a piece of it where I feel like I've squeezed the juice out of that lemon. Um, but there is a big piece of it where I found a lot of disillusionment at Burning Man. A lot of I went there expecting, true radical self-expression and true radical inclusion, um and what I found there was, well, people and the world. and um and I found a lot of hypocrisy. I found a surprising amount of sexism, a surprising amount of abuse of power, even in just sort of small ways, like who gets to get on the art car. And that's just at the sort of individual sort of friend group level. Then you get to the organizational level. There's so much exploitation of labor with DPW and the volunteers, the ongoing debate about diversity, which shouldn't even be a debate. COVID safety. There's just so much mental health. How many people have committed suicide who worked for the organization? Um, I'm not anti-Burning Man by any means, but I am a Burning Man skeptic for sure. And it feels important the reason I put it that way in my bio is it feels important that people understand, like, Burning Man is a shorthand for a lot, a certain kind of person and experience and culture and cultural exposure. Um, but it's also shorthand for a certain kind of, um, extremism isn't the word, but I put in defector so people know that I am a skeptical, thoughtful, ethical critic of Burning Man, as well as a child of Burning Man, if that makes sense. Um, so yeah, I have a lot of love for Burning Man and what it brought to my life, and also it's been a place of it. Like, some of the probably the 4 best days of my life happened at Burning Man, and like 27 of the worst happened at Burning Man. And most of my time at Burning Man was straight up miserable. And some of that is just because that's how those things are, but some of that was because of these dynamics that, like the fact that I could never go to Burning Man again because there's no way to do it disabled unless you're also rich is, in my opinion, kind of fucked, So.
Yeah, there's just that.
But essentially, Burning Man is a microcosm of the rest of the world, and that's part of the disillusionment at Burning Man and at all of these places, was that I went there hoping that it would be different.
That
And
it
wherever
claims
I
to not
went,
be.
there
That's the
the
hypocrisy.
humans were. And generally, my feeling in all of these places is I was less upset about what the thing turned out to be than I was that it pretended not to be it.
That's such a great way to put it. I think that that's true for so many of these things. It is so much better when you know what you're getting into.
I mean, if you just showed up at Burning Man and they said, look, as long as you wear these outfits, you like these drugs, you like these DJs, you say these things, you're going to have a great time. Everyone will love you and it's going to work out just great. And if you really want to have a good, if you really want to get in, then like your third or fourth year, join DPW, you'll be set for life. But they just said that when you walk in, you can decide you're going to opt in, you're going to opt out, but showing up thinking that you can be whatever version of you are and feeling completely alone. And then as soon as you wear the uniform, suddenly you're visible. That's
Yeah,
a kind of mind fuck and a disillusionment that'll mess you up.
of
And
course.
that happens at all the organizations and all the communes as well. So
Yeah. Sort of a good general purpose, all around answer. Uh,
exactly.
Thank you so much for doing this with us. This is terrific. I'm really glad you're willing to share all of these because, yes, you have a wealth of experience.
Thank you so much for letting me do this. This is my favorite topic. If anyone wants to talk more about it, contact me anytime.
All right.
Yeah, I'm really honored to be here. Thanks.
This
And
is
thank you to all
awesome.
of you who came.